Thanks everyone for coming, and so I understand the participants online as well. Let me just give a very brief introduction to our speaker today, Professor Henry Gao from Singapore Management University School of Law. And I should have remembered by now his main titles, senior positions, but I still want to read out briefly. He obviously sits on the advisory board of the WTO Chairs Program, which is obviously a very important linkage between the international organization and academia. He's also a member of the editorial boards of Journal of International Economic Law and the Journal of Financial Regulation. But having put all these titles aside, I mean, Henry has been the leading scholar on international economic law in China. And I had my lots of fortune to work with them and learn from him in the past at least 7 years. And Henry has been a contributor, major contributor, external to civil work activities, and is also a current civil member. And the topic is going to talk to us today. I mean, it's a work that we read, I think we'll have already read for a couple of years, but the book just came out. And obviously the topic is very, very significant and relevant to what we are talking about on a daily basis, which is on the nexus, I would say the nexus between international trade law, state sovereignty, and data. So Henry will take us through the kind of intriguing, I would say, connections or relationship between the three pillars, and especially how state sovereignty informs and influences international trade agreements on this kind of cutting-edge issue of data. All right, Henry, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Wei Huan, my good friend and longtime collaborator, and also thanks to everyone who have joined here, old and new friends. So it's really my pleasure to be back to Sydney the first time since the pandemic, and to speak at a CIBO, which is also where I presented in Sydney before the pandemic. So the title for my paper is on data sovereignty and trade agreements, the three digital kingdoms. So this paper grew out of a conference that was supposed to be held in Hong Kong in early 2020. And the conference was basically on digital sovereignty issues. And I was asked to look at it from the trade perspective. But as everyone would know, what happened in early 2020 because of the pandemic, the conference didn't happen. Instead it was held online. And the book took a long time and only published recently, as mentioned by Wei Huan. But still, so as the additional bonus to those of you who show up today, either in person or online, I will try to add, some of the latest developments based on the progress of the e-commerce negotiations in the WTO when we conclude the presentation. So as we all know, digital trade has become so important in recent years, and with the rise of digital trade, different countries also all rush to try to claim sovereignty on the regulatory issues concerning digital trade and especially data issues. But how should we think about these issues? So in this paper, at the outset, I started with sorry, this one is not working. Yeah, oh, okay, it works. Okay, so my presentation is based on these three papers, basically, which I have done for the past few years, whereby I first of all started looking at the regulation of digital trade issues in U.S. trade agreements, looking at the U.S. approach. And then I move on to compare the U.S. approach with the Chinese approach. And this paper is the last of the trilogy in the sense that I compare the regulatory approaches of the three main players, U.S., China, and EU. So at the outset, I would like to take a step back and walk you through the main stakeholders when we talk about digital trade governance. I analyze it by looking at three main players in the paper. The first one is a firm, okay? So firms like Alibaba, like Google, like Facebook, and so on. So these firms are the main providers of digital trade, either trading goods or trading services. But as we can see, for many of these firms, it is very important for you to have two things. First, to have a free flow of data across the border, and second, to have no data localization requirements. Why? Because many of these firms operate on global level, and for them, it would be impossible for them to operate if every country requires data localization and each country impose restrictions on free flow of data. On the other hand, you have the consumers. So the consumers are the ones who generate the raw data, right? And which then are used by the firms and turn into their business data and so on. For consumers, we actually, for many of these digital trade services, we use it for free, right? For example, Google search, Facebook, and so on, they don't charge you, right? You use it for free. But what is the main concern for us as consumers? The main concern is the protection of privacy or personal data, right? You do not want the world knows what you are searching, right, on a Saturday night, right, when you are too bored, right? You do not want, everyone to see, the posts you post on the Facebook unless, they belong to your close friends and so on, right? So for consumer, the protection of personal data is the most important issue. On the other hand, we also have the government. The government is not a direct player in this, right? The government does not provide or use the service directly, but instead the government is the regulator. So the government might want to regulate the interaction between the firm and the consumer for various reasons. For law enforcement reasons, for example, right, when the government want to chase down some, criminals, or for national security reasons when the government try to deal with a certain national security risks and so on. So that is the three different players. As you can see, their interests differ across each other and sometimes even conflict with each other, right? So, for example, between the firm and the consumer, when the consumer try to protect their data, they will not want the data to cross the border easily, right? But for the firms, the core business model, for example, for Facebook is that they will be able to aggregate the data and then use these to generate whatever valuable information that they want to distill. So if you look at regulation of digital trade, normally speaking, the main forum for regulating these issues should be at the WTO, which is this global organization which deals with global trade, including digital trade issues. But because of the lack of progress in the WTO, so far, if you look at the WTO has been trying to regulate e-commerce issues since 1998, when Bill Clinton basically pushed the other WTO members to agree to this declaration on global e-commerce and start negotiating e-commerce issues in the WTO. But now, 26 years after this discussion was launched in the WTO, we have achieved nothing in the WTO except a very fragile moratorium on customs duties, which was contained in the original declaration, which basically says we should continue our existing practice of not imposing customs duties on electronic commerce. Other than that, the WTO has not been able to achieve anything, even though they have an ambitious work program, which encompasses several different bodies like the Council for Trading Services, for Trading Goods, TRIPS Council, the Council for Trade and Development, and so on. Only since 2016 have members renewed their interest on negotiations on e-commerce, and the negotiation only started in January 2019 in Davos. So in lieu of a global rule at the WTO, instead, what we have is regulation of e-commerce and digital trade and data issues, and domestic law, free trade agreements, and various bilateral initiatives. So I would classify the main models for the regulation of digital trade into three main digital kingdoms that is represented by the US, EU, and China. And now let's look at the differences among these three different approaches. First, the US. So for the US, the key has been this twin obligation of a free data flow across the border and also prohibition of data localization requirements. If you look at US FTAs, the US started to include e-commerce issues in the FTA that signed with Jordan in 2000. That was the very first one to include e-commerce issues. And the latest one was the USMCA, which was signed under the Trump administration. If you compare all these e-commerce chapters in US FTAs, they all look very similar. They all include these twin provisions of free cross-border data flow and also prohibition of data localization requirements. So that basically reflects the interest of the firm, as I mentioned earlier. And that is not surprisingly, right, given that most of these global digital trade firms are based in the US. In terms of privacy, the US actually does not have a comprehensive privacy protection framework. Instead, the US only has a patchwork of sector-specific laws. For example, in the US, there is a law on video rental. Now, for those of you who have lived in the US before Netflix took over, you would know that in the US, before Netflix was started, the biggest video rental company in the US was called Blockbuster, right? So they have stores everywhere in every major city and so on. So basically what you do is that you have to drive to the store and you rent the physical DVD, right? And then you go back home and play it on your DVD player and then you send it back. Actually, when Netflix first started, I was in the US when Netflix first started, I actually used their service. They also had a similar business model. Back then, their website did not include all this streaming media. Instead, what they did was that, the website simply contains a catalog of the DVDs. So you subscribe as a member, and then you choose the DVD you want, and they will mail it to you, mail the physical DVD to you in a mail, in a kind of a vinyl package. And then once you finish, you drop it in the mail, send it back to them. Okay, so very, very similar to Blockbuster. But I guess when you rent your video, you do not want your friends or sometimes even family members know which videos you rented, right? If you have rented some X-rated videos, right? So you want to keep it to yourself. So that is why in the US, there's a law which says if you operate a video rental business, you have to keep the records of the customers, confidential. You cannot just leak this information, right? So that is specific to video rental business. Similarly, they also have a similar laws for credit reports, right? Everyone need a credit score, right, in the US to get the credit card. So that is very similar. So as you can see in the US, basically, they have laws specific to each sector, but there is no one comprehensive legislation like the GDPR in the EU, which would regulate every sector. And this is coupled with enforcement by the FTC and also self-regulation by the firms, okay? And the US has been very active in including language on free flow data and prohibition of data localization agreements in its FTAs. So if you look at the TPP and the USMCA, they all include these provisions. Now, quickly, let's move on to EU. By the way, how long should I speak? About 30 minutes? Okay, all right, okay. So I try to make sure that I stay within the allocated time so that we can have more time for discussion. So if you look at the EU is quite different from the US. For the EU, the most important issue is privacy, right? As reflected in the GDPR, which is the first comprehensive regulation on privacy in the whole world. So the key innovation made in the GDPR is that compared to the US approach, where, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the privacy for video rental business, you would only have such a privacy right if you are a consumer in the video rental business. If you have ever rented a video, right, before, but if you are like Wei Huang, who have never rented a video before, then there's no such record of him to speak of, right? So of course he doesn't, right? So he doesn't have such a right, right, as a consumer. But the GDPR changed this by regulating privacy as a fundamental human right. So if you look at the GDPR, both in the main text and especially in the recitals, where they kept referring to privacy as a fundamental human right. So this doesn't matter whether you're a consumer, right, in a specific sector. So long as you are human, you would enjoy such a right. And that is a big innovation from the GDPR by elevating, the right from a consumer right, which is more like a commercial right, which can easily, be abridged compared to human right, fundamental human right, which cannot be infringed upon unless you have some really, really strong, reasons such as national security and so on. Okay. Another feature of the GDPR is this extraterritorial requirement. So basically, under the GDPR, if you are dealing with personal information, you will not be allowed to export this personal information from the EU to other countries, except under one of two conditions. One is if the other country adopt a legislation that is the same as the GDPR, which will be hard to do, right? Because most countries would want to, tweak it. Second, if your privacy regulation is recognized as providing adequate protection, okay, as under the GDPR. So this gives rise to the so-called adequacy decision. So you would only be able to transfer the data from the EU to your country if your country's privacy regime is has received a so-called adequacy decision from the EU. And so far, only about a dozen countries actually have their privacy regime recognized as adequate by the EU. So as you can see, these would make the GDPR kind of an extra territorial legislation in the sense that it can also influence the laws of other countries. But for a long time, the EU was not able to include provisions on either data privacy or other issues in trade agreements. And the reason is because of an internal struggle between different divisions within the EU. As we know, in the EU, trade issues is handled by DG Trade, okay, which take care of trade issues. But privacy protection is handled by DG Justice, which takes care of all these, human rights and so on issues. So for a long time, there was a tough fight between these two director generals. And finally, in early 2018, the two DGs finally reached an internal compromise so that they agreed to a common position, which is in future free trade agreements, first of all, the EU would inscribe the horizontal clause on free flow data and ban on data localization requirements. So that is the demand from DG Trade. And on the other hand, they would also, in the same agreement, affirm the EU's right to regulate, which would not be subject to investor state dispute settlement mechanism. So this is to make sure that the DG Justice power would not be, cut back because of trade agreements. Now, if you look at the existing FTAs by the EU, so far we have yet to see the EU aggressively enforcing the extraterritorial element of the GDPR. Instead, for many of the existing FTAs, they haven't really started, requiring the trade partners to include these privacy provisions. But as I mentioned earlier, the GDPR could be potentially very intrusive, okay? Now, let's turn to China, which is the last of the digital kingdoms. So for China, the most important issue is data security, or what President Xi would call data sovereignty. President Xi has said on many occasions that there is no national sovereignty without data sovereignty. So as you can see, China has elevated the issue to the level of national security or even sovereignty. So therefore, it takes a totally different approach compared to either the US or the EU. First of all, if you look at the US approach, right, free flow of data, China, because of censorship, there's no free flow of data, right? But this is a bit different from the EU's approach. For the EU, they want to restrict the export of data, right, because of privacy concerns. But for China, it is the other way. China has the Great Firewall, which try to block the entry, right, of data from abroad, right? Try to block all these websites such as Facebook, right, such as WhatsApp, Google, and so on. And on privacy, China had no law on privacy until 2001, where it enacted the first privacy law. And even after China enacted its personal information protection law about 3 years ago, the privacy protection still remains weak. I mean, it has, for example, the latest personal information protection law include many provisions on privacy protection by copying from the GDPR. But at the same time, a big weakness of this law is that there are too many exemptions for the government. For example, if the government want to access, want to process, or want to, even delete your data, they not only do not need to obtain your consent according to the personal information protection law. On several occasions, they do not even need to let you know that they are getting access to your data. So that is quite drastic. And when China introduced the cybersecurity law in 2017, it also included this controversial provision, which requires data localization for the so-called critical information infrastructure operator, the so-called CIO. If you have data which are generated from your operation in China, then you will be required to store the data locally. And they are still working on what are the criteria for critical information infrastructure. But according to what I understand so far in the current drafts, the definition is very broad, which could capture virtually every major e-commerce business. So it is based both on by sector. So if you are in specific sectors, such as energy, and so on, that would be considered as critical information infrastructure. Or if you exceed a certain threshold, like if you have 500,000 active users, which is very easy for a big country like China, then you could easily be labeled as critical information infrastructure. So if you look at China's trade agreements, China only started to include e-commerce issues in its FTA with Australia and Korea. But even in these e-commerce chapters, it is rather limited because they mainly talk about trade facilitation issues. So they keep talking about, things such as the paperless trading, such as a single window electronic authentication and electronic signature and so on. And not surprisingly, because that reflects the interests of Chinese firms like Alibaba, who has been pushing for this so-called EWTP, Electronic World Trade Platform Initiative, which basically aims to help firms like Alibaba to have their goods cross the border and so on. But since Jack Ma fell out of favor a few years ago, I don't think they have been as aggressive in trying to include these issues in trade agreements so far. So you don't really hear about them talking about this anymore. When Jack Ma was still flying high, he actually managed to persuade the WTO to enter into a kind of a joint arrangement with the Alibaba on the EWTP initiative when Azevedo was the Director General of the WTO. But then Azevedo left his WTO DJ job for Pepsi, so now, I guess he just enjoys drinking Pepsi, he doesn't worry about these issues anymore. So why do we have all these differences? In the paper, I explored two reasons for the differences among the three digital kingdoms. First of all, these three countries all have a different commercial interests. If you look at the top 10 largest digital firms in the world, about 6 are American firms and 4 are Chinese firms. So who are the American firms? The American firms tend to be purely digital companies like Facebook, like Google, Netflix, and so on. So these firms, in other words, they do not trade in physical goods. Instead, they do not trade in atoms. They only trade in bits, okay? So for them, it is crucial to have a free flow of data and also prohibition on data localization requirements. On the other hand, if you look at the Chinese firms on the list, they tend to be Alibaba and JD.com, which are still traditional trade in goods firms, right? The only difference is that they move the platform for trade from, the offline physical store to this online marketplace, okay? So at the end of the day, to carry out the trade, you still need to have the goods cross the border and so on. So that is why Alibaba, for example, has been pushing for all these trade facilitation issues, which basically help firms setting on Alibaba on Taobao to simplify the trade. And that is why China is taking this position, which focus largely on trade facilitation issues. So how about the EU? Well, the EU has no firm on the top 10 list. And even if you expand it to top 20, you would find very few European firms on the list. Part of the reason is because in the EU, you really have a fragmented market, right? Because each EU country would have a different language, right? So that makes it very hard for you to have kind of global operations. I mean, even Amazon, they have to have different web pages for France, for Germany, for Spain, and so on because of the different language. But on the other hand, the EU has one of the biggest markets in the whole world, right? Other than the US and China, the biggest e-commerce market is in the EU. And because the regulatory issues are decided by Brussels, so this means that the EU has a lot of regulatory power. So that is where the EU comes in. When they see that, they do not have a major global players like the US and China, but they do have the regulatory power, they think that their way of influencing the development of digital trade is by enacting new regulations on e-commerce. And indeed, if you look at the GDPR, right, the very first regulation on privacy, right, if you look at all these new, legislations that Brussels is currently introducing, for example, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, and so on, these are all the EU's effort to use their market power as a way to shape the rules for digital trade. And I guess, if you are cynical, you could even argue that what the EU is doing is the digital protectionism. That is, by erecting high barriers to American and Chinese firms, and therefore to create a room for growth for European firms, right? So that is a part of the hidden agenda. Another reason is because these three different players also have different regulatory philosophy. For the US, as I argued in my paper, which look at the U.S. Regulation on digital trade in trade agreements, you could argue that the very reason why Silicon Valley was so successful, especially in the first 20 years or so, was because there was no regulation, okay, by the U.S. government, okay? So it was basically the wild, wild west for the e-commerce market, right? When, because of the lack of regulation, therefore, firms were able to experiment with all kinds of new business models, and that led to the prosperity in the internet sector in the US. And this is even reflected in the US law as well. If you look at the US Telecommunication Act, there's a provision which says that we should make sure that the internet is remain unfettered by federal and state regulation. So they regard the government regulation as basically an obstacle to the development of the sector. And they want this sector to remain unfettered by government regulation, right? So that pretty much captures the regulatory philosophy, the kind of a laissez-faire, philosophy by the U.S. administration, basically since Bill Clinton all the way until Obama. But the wind is changing, okay? And the current Biden administration, as I will get to in a moment, they are rethinking their regulatory approach. So the U.S. is moving its regulatory approach. For China, as I argued in another paper, where I look at the evolution of data regulation in China since 1994, when the internet was first started in China. I argue that China has had a history of heavy government intervention from the very beginning. In 94, when the internet was first introduced in China, the Chinese government came up with regulation, which basically says, if you want to connect to the internet, okay, so that is the internet outside of China, not the Chinese internet, which I would call an intranet, okay, a giant intranet. You need to go through a gateway that is sanctioned by the Chinese government, okay? And so far, there are only like half a dozen gateways which you could use to connect to the worldwide internet. And that means that the government started with the regulation of hardware. And later, the government started to regulate the software, okay? So basically, even the software you could use would need to be sanctioned by the government. When you go to China, if you couldn't access your Gmail, you might want to use a VPN. But let me warn you, technically that is illegal under Chinese law. Okay, you cannot just have a VPN because the Chinese government has explicitly stated that using VPN, no matter for what purposes, is illegal. Okay, right? So actually, recently there has been a few cases where firms try to do international trade, right? So they use VPN to connect with the clients through Gmail and WhatsApp, and they were caught by the government, and they were punished by paying a hefty fine, for that. Okay. And later, the government also moved on the regulation of content. Okay, when China has for a long time had this list about a dozen items that you cannot post on the internet. Okay, and then now moving on to the regulation of the data. Okay, so this is reflected in the data security law and the cyber security law that China introduced in recent years. So in China, there has been a strong history of heavy government regulation, so that explains China's focus on national security. For the EU, compared to the US and China, the EU suffered a lot during the Second World War, right? So because of all these atrocities, the EU, after the Second World War, have tried very hard to protect human rights. So that is why you see the European Convention on Human Rights, right, and also the European Court on Human Rights, right, which basically emphasize on human rights protection, and that also explains why the GDPR elevates privacy protection from a consumer right to a fundamental human right. And I should mention that the three digital kingdoms is not just limited to US, EU, and China, even though I use them as the most prominent examples. But you can find similar patterns in the regulation of different countries around the world. There was a study done by Martin Farrakhan and Marvel a few years ago, where they look at the world regulations by different countries on two issues: free flow of data and data localization requirements. And as you can see, basically most countries around the world can be fit into one of these three models that I mentioned, right? Where you see, countries adopting similar regulatory philosophy would have a similar approach, right? For example, Australia shares that of US, okay, Russia shares that of China, and so on and so forth, okay? So with the divergence among all these different regimes, what would the future be like? I guess, you know, it was hard to answer this question a few years ago, but recently, with all these latest developments, it becomes clearer and clearer that we seem to have a convergence of different regimes. For example, in the US, during the Trump administration, the US actually tried to borrow from the Chinese playbook by resorting to censorship and also blockage of foreign websites and apps, right? When they try to block TikTok and WeChat, right? And also in October 2023, the US government sent a major shockwave in WTO by announcing in Geneva that they are now withdrawing their support of the provisions on data flow and data localization, and also the prohibition of forced transfer of source code, which is less important, but also included in many US FTAs. So that is a major change in US policy. Why did the US change its position? The US government never explicitly stated that, but from what I can gather, you know, from my understanding of the shift in US regulatory approach, there are two reasons. The first reason is because they want to free up their hands to enforce antitrust laws against these big tech firms, right? So you all saw probably the Congress hearing on Facebook, right? And on these digital giants. So if you look at it, yeah, antitrust laws, yeah. So if you look at the new FTC headed by Lena Khan, right, who is known to have, anti big business, attitudes. So it is unsurprising that she would want to, aggressively enforce U.S. antitrust laws. The second reason is because the administration want to beef up the protection of workers' rights and also consumer rights, right? So every time, after Catherine Tai came in as the new USTR, every time when she was talking about trade policy, she doesn't refer to trade policy per se. Instead, she always referred to it as worker-centered trade policy, okay? So this worker protection is very important, right? I mean, if you are familiar with the tech regulation, you will understand that, for example, the protection of these gig workers, right, like Uber drivers and so on, that has been a really controversial issue. So the U.S. also wanted to, freeze their position on this issue, so that they can pursue more worker protection and so on. But, most of my friends in Washington would agree with me in that we all think that the U.S. approach actually is misguided. I mean, trade policy is one thing, right? Domestic antitrust and also labor law enforcement is related, but it is still separate, right? So the fact that you adopt, this type of trade policy does not necessarily, ban your hands when it comes to the enforcement of antitrust and labor laws. But still, the Biden administration, after now 6 months, have stick to this position, which I think is probably unlikely to change until after the end of the year. Why? Because they want to signal to the voters, right? We are protecting your rights as workers, as consumers, okay? Vote for us, okay? So this is more like a political move. As to whether the U.S. would continue this position after the elections later this year, I'm not so sure. My personal prediction is that probably, regardless of who is in the White House next year, they will probably change this position because the opposition from the big tech is so strong. The big companies like Google, Facebook, which are all big donors to, Democratic Party and actually to both political party, and also the U.S. Chambers of Commerce are all against this. So maybe next year they will change the position. For China, You also start to see China start to take a more flexible approach. So 4 years ago, when I was writing about e-commerce negotiation and the joint statement initiative in the WTO and China, I had a kind of a debate with a leading U.S. Digital trade expert. His opinion is that China would never agree to the twin provisions on free flow of data and prohibition on data localization requirements. Therefore, China should be kicked out of the WTO negotiations on e-commerce. And I disagree with him. I told him, look, China's #1 priority is national security. So long as you have some way of addressing these issues in a trade agreement, then China would be willing to accept these obligations on free flow data and a prohibition on data localization requirements. So after a few years after that, my prediction was confirmed by the e-commerce chapter in the RCEP, which China signed, right? If you look at the RCEP e-commerce chapter, it did include provisions on free flow data, on prohibition on data localization requirements. But of course, this is coupled with extensive exceptions clauses for both public policy and also for security, okay? So this is contained actually in the 2 provisions itself, right? And also they made clear that this is self-judging, so that addressed China's concern. So that is why China agreed to these issues in the RCEP, which is unprecedented. And now China is also seeking access to the CPTPP and DIPA, which is even stronger than the RCEP, because these 2 provisions under the RCEP, even though they look very similar to the provisions under the CPTPP and DIPA, but they are not subject to dispute settlement. So that means that their enforceability is limited. But if you look at the CPTPP and DIPA, these provisions are subject to the normal dispute settlement system and both agreement. So if China accedes to this agreement, China would be agreeable to subject itself to dispute settlement on these issues. So, for the EU, as I said, the EU has not been seeking adequate decisions from most of its trade partners. It only slowly started to include some of these issues. So the EU approach is already the kind of a middle ground, but the EU basically help other countries to promote privacy protection by using the GDPR as a kind of a model, okay? So to conclude, I would say that, even though all these 3 digital kingdoms each have their, problems, their concerns, but in the long run, we might see a bit of a convergence of different regimes, and this is actually confirmed by recent news from Geneva, where I heard from my friends, the Singapore ambassador to the WTO, who is one of the 3 co-conveners on e-commerce, that they are making good progress on e-commerce negotiation. And despite of the U.S. withdrawal on these twin provisions, it seems that they can agree to a subset of provisions, hopefully within this year. And that deal would include all of the 3 main players, US, EU, and China. And hopefully that would pave the way for more rules on digital trade at the global level. So I would conclude here, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Henry. And obviously, every time I listen to you, I can't resist just let you finish it and wrapping up. And but I think we still have 15 minutes for Q&A. And do we also have space for online questions or not? I guess if not, I'll just focus on I'll just focus on this. Okay, right.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Gao, for the very insightful comments. And indeed, I've been thinking, while you're making the presentation, like what contributed to those differences, and the later part of your presentation really convincingly presented like the different interests and regulatory philosophy. So I was attending a conference earlier that Wei Huan organized on the green transition. And one of the papers that I asked to comment actually criticized this administrative dominance in carbon markets in China and how that distorted the market forces. So it seems that this regulatory philosophy might also be present in some other domains or areas. So my question is, despite this sort of general regulatory philosophy between the three different kingdoms, and do you see any, is that a reflection of their general approach, or do we see any variation of this regulatory approach between different matters like digital trade, investment, IP competition, environmental issues, or dispute settlement? And in other words, that you mentioned about the possible convergence of different regimes. So would the convergence be easier in certain domains than others because of specific, national interest consideration or pragmatic considerations? Thank you.
Yeah, should I answer now?
Yeah, I think yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Professor Fan, for that very interesting question. Now, I claim less expertise on other issues because I'm primarily a trade lawyer, so I know much less about investment, and the other areas of law than you and other people. But I think that in general, you do see similar approaches reflected in other areas. Actually, on climate or sustainable development that you mentioned, Wei Huan and we just published a new paper in the Journal of International Economic Law on China's approach to climate change and energy transition, right? Where we noted kind of a similar government-dominated approach when it comes to climate adaptation in China. I guess, despite all these differences, the reality of the world that we are living in is that we increasingly start to see convergences among different, players. So, for example, you see the U.S., as you rightly pointed out, resorting more and more to national security, right, as a justification for imposing all kinds of restrictions, not only on China, right, but also on other countries. If you remember the Trump tariffs on steel and aluminum, right, so that was justified on national security ground, right, and also you see that everybody tried to copy China's, development model, the one that relies heavily on industrial policy, and government planning. By enacting, for example, in the U.S., the CHIPS Act, right, and in the EU, similar initiatives to provide subsidies, right, to various sectors such as the renewable energy sector and so on. So, unfortunately, we start to see a convergence, and this convergence is everybody. I mean, for me as a trade lawyer, I would say this is everybody learning from the worst part of everybody else, because what you are basically seeing is that, countries started to disregard the rules of WTO and start to, embrace industrial policy, subsidies, and, all kinds of shady restrictions on national security grounds without, giving due regard to WTO rules. So that is very bad, for the global trading system. And hopefully, I hope they can find some sort of a grand bargain, that we have a new set of rules, which will stabilize things. But I don't know how long it would take for us to get there. Yeah. Yes.
Surely you have to isolate out those problems. They're a different thing. There are protectionist problems and the resort to national security, but there are some fundamental regulatory issues with collection of data that are a little bit similar to the reason why we have an annex on financial services about prudential regulation. We have an annex on telecoms about maintaining the integrity of your public telecoms network. I think the reality is that this whole electronic domain has overtaken the speed of governments to catch up. And so governments are behind in many types of regulation. And so I think when countries come together to negotiate freedom of certain transactions electronically, they probably need to reserve policy space, not just to do the things that they're doing now, but to do all the things that they haven't got around to doing yet. Let me give you two simple examples. I couldn't register for this seminar without disclosing my residential address to Eventbrite. Now, you know, I think that should be illegal. Should be a law against refusing to supply a service on the grounds that you've failed to supply some completely irrelevant and unnecessary personal information. And governments do need to catch up with that. I can't renew my membership at the surf club without giving them a scanned copy of my driver's license. I just tell them to get lost. You can't have a scanned copy of my driver's license. I'm not prepared to take the risk that you can or can't keep it secure. I know that the data has a lot of value because people trawl it and work out lots of things to do with it. But, you know, I think that the whole introduction of electronic commerce has just gone so fast that the development of privacy law has not kept up. We don't have enough regulation of the internet to stop phoenixing of companies, resurfacing of banned directors. We don't have enough regulation of the internet so that customers even know the identity of the legal entity that they're dealing with half the time. I mean, there are so many areas of government regulation which have not caught up that if you were thinking of doing something like, you know, the annex on financial services or the annex on telecom services, I don't think it's just a matter of thinking about data localization rules. It's a matter of having the freedom to pass laws that prohibit people from insisting on collecting unnecessary data. The other area of data is if it were illegal for someone to keep a record of the fact that I read an article in the paper saying that Trump's election was stolen or saying that Tiananmen Square murders, massacres never happened, then no one would be able to target me with more articles about the same piece of news. And so you wouldn't have this problem that we have in society now where one half of society believes that massive fraud stole the election in the US and the other side of society thinks it's not. And the reason is because they're reading completely different news, because the people who supply the news know exactly who's susceptible to reading which one. It's a different world to the world where you walked into a library and read an article and put it down and no one knew what you'd read. And, you know, so I just think there's a whole universe of areas where governments need to get going to prohibit people operating in the digital space from collecting the information in the first place, let alone sending it across borders or minimising. So, you know, I'm interested to know what you think about that. It's not just a question of data localisation, but it's a question of regulating what people are allowed to collect about you. And I acknowledge there are different philosophies because in China, they don't really have a national security policy. They have a political security of the Communist Party policy, and that trumps everything. But in Europe, I think there is a pervading philosophy that said we fought an incredibly awful war because we did not want to have a society where other people collect information about us. That's not the sort of society that we fought to live in.
Mhm.
Anyway.
Well, great question, Brad, as always. But first, minor disagreement on the lack of a national security policy in China. There is a national security policy.
It's not about the nation, China, it's about the communism.
Yes, that is for sure. Okay, but in China, you know, you have a party state. Okay, so you could, you know, at least according to the CCP, it's the same. Okay. Yeah. Now, regarding your main question, basically, you know, what kind of regulatory approach we should adopt? I'm glad you raised the example of the annex on financial regulations, and also the reference paper on telecommunication, right? Which are actually, you know, what got me into e-commerce in the first place when I worked on the Mexico telecom case as a member of the Secretariat 20 years ago. So that is what started me in e-commerce. But I think, you know, these two sectors actually provide us with very good reasons as to why we need to, see an evolution of the regulatory approach. Take financial services, for example. If you look at the CPTPP, in the e-commerce chapter, there is actually a carve out for financial services, right? So basically, despite of the ban on data localization requirements, it doesn't apply to the financial services sector. Why? Because the Fed was against it. The Fed was telling the USTR, look, so that was, the US started negotiating the TPP shortly after the 2008 financial crisis, right? So the memory was still fresh. So they said, okay, if you take away our regulatory, autonomy, if you do not require local storage, what if something like 2008 happened again, right? All these banks, they would just run away. We have no access to the data. How could we regulate them? And the USTR agreed. But then when you look at the USMCA, the USMCA actually changed approach by also including financial services for the same obligation on prohibition on data localization. So there was no longer a carve out for financial services for e-commerce obligations. Why? Because the USTR was able to persuade the Fed, look, what you really care about is not where the data is stored. What you care about is that you would have immediate, ongoing, and sustained access to data whenever you want it, okay? So that is why they changed the provision, so that so long as you have immediate, ongoing, and sustained access to financial data, you should not require data localization, even for the financial services sector, okay? So that means that, so long as you are willing to adapt your regulatory approach based on the evolving, environment, then you should be able to find a way to address all these regulatory issues that you mentioned. So that is where I also slightly disagree with your, suggestion on the regulatory approach. I mean, I agree that. Yes, yes. And that is largely because all these digital firms grew too big, right? So they grew too powerful, right? So that it's hard for the government to regulate them. But at the end of the day, when you regulate this sector, you also need to work together rather than work against these big firms, because they understand the technical, bits of all these, trade and so on. So I think Singapore is adopting a good model. In Singapore, we have all these regulatory sandboxes, when it comes to fintech regulation, when it comes to AI regulation. For example, Singapore's recent AI verified framework is basically the government working together with the firms, so that the firms can, refer to this framework, which include a few indicators, which can demonstrate, the capabilities of the AI, model, the introduced, and so on. So I think that should be the approach: the government working together with the firms, rather than the government just crack down on the tech firms without any input from the business firms. I don't think that would be the right approach. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Henry. Thank you so much. And thanks for the audience. And that's a fantastic exchange. I'm sure we'll have more time to discuss.
Sure.
All right.